Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the webinar Roadmap for Electric Transportation, Options for Lawmakers, hosted by the Regulatory Assistance Project. My name is Clara Summers, and I am the Climate and Energy Manager at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL. NCEL empowers a nonpartisan network of legislative champions to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. Electrifying the transportation sector is a key tool in addressing climate change, as well as reducing air pollution. Transportation electrification, cars, trucks, buses, taxis, and ports, just to name a few examples, also provides an opportunity for states to save residents money and create jobs. High levels of electric vehicle adoption with smart charging can provide benefits to all of society, not just EV owners, as well as the power grid. But these benefits can only be fully realized with the help of carefully crafted state legislation. RAP has developed a roadmap to support state legislators in their efforts, which you will hear more about today. State legislators are already being proactive about supporting transportation electrification. So today we're going to explore the different avenues states have taken and what remains to be done. Our panelists will provide examples and analysis of how states have addressed barriers to EVs, taken steps on EV planning, created incentives, and empowered regulatory agencies. We have a great lineup of experts today, and I will take a moment to introduce them all, starting with Camille Kadoch. Camille is a member of the policy group at RAP and general counsel. Her recent work has focused on issues related to transportation electrification, performance-based regulation, energy efficiency obligations, no regrets planning, and beneficial electrification. I'd also like to introduce Dave Farnsworth, who is a principal with RAP. He advises regulators and advocates on clean energy and environmental policy and regulation. Prior to working with RAP, he served as a hearing officer and staff attorney with the Vermont Public Service Board from 1995 to 2008. Next, we will also hear from Mark LeBel, who is an associate with RAP focusing on rate design and regulatory reform, including compensation for distributed energy resources, the evolution of the electricity system, and beneficial electrification. Before joining RAP, Mark was a staff attorney at Acadia Center and an appointed member of the Massachusetts Zero Emission Vehicle Commission. Finally, we have Rick Weston, who is a principal with RAP and currently is RAP's Director of Policy. For most of the last decade, he directed RAP's China program. 4 years before joining RAP in 1999, he was an economist and hearing officer with the Vermont Public Service Board, now the PUC. So before we start in earnest, just a few housekeeping items. I know a lot of folks are familiar with webinars, but it's always good to go through logistics at the beginning. There are a lot of folks on the line. We're thrilled to have you today, but it means that we're going to keep all participants muted during the webinar. And the content portion of the webinar is going to run approximately a half hour, after which we will answer questions. While the official end is at the hour mark, we will stay on for an additional half hour if there are more questions. How do you submit questions? Glad you asked. We encourage you to submit questions into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. As I said, there will be a designated time to answer questions, but feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Many of you also submitted questions with registration, so I think there will be a lively discussion. Final note, we are recording this session for those who are unable to attend, and in a few days' time, we will send out an email with links to the recording and the slides. So as we're getting started, it's good to get on the same page and make sure that we're speaking the same dialect of alphabet soup. So we want to briefly define a few things for those who are not steeped in electric vehicle terminology. Starting with, we will talk about BEVs or battery electric vehicles, PHEVs, plug-in hybrid vehicles, and different levels of charging. Level 1 charger can replace about 4 to 5 miles of driving for each hour of charging. A level 2 charger is faster than level 1, delivering about 15 to 25 miles of range. And a DC fast charge is the most rapid recharging, adding 50 to 170 miles of range in a half hour. We'll also use the term EVSE, which is electric vehicle supply equipment or EV charging equipment, as well as ZEV, which is a zero emissions vehicle. We will also offer road-related puns throughout. And with that, I'm going to transition over to Dave. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Clara. Hello, everyone. Glad you could join us today. You know, as Clara just mentioned, when we talk about electric vehicles or EVs, we're talking about cars and school buses, transit buses, trucks of all sizes. EVs can save you money. Consumer Reports tells us that they're cheaper to run, cheaper to maintain. They're flexible in when they can charge, so owners can take advantage of cleaner and less expensive energy when it becomes available at certain times of the day. EVs have a smaller carbon footprint than gasoline-powered cars, no matter where your electricity comes from. And the grid's getting cleaner as gas and renewables displace coal. EVs reduce air emissions, which are obviously bad for the planet and for public health. More EVs translates into less asthma, bronchitis, and cancer, and fewer premature deaths. EVs cut your oil use and hedge your exposure to gasoline price hikes affected by supply and demand dynamics in international markets beyond our control. Many say that EVs are a better driving experience. The point is, EVs can deliver numerous benefits for consumers and state economies. Next slide, thank you. But by the same token, there are numerous barriers to the broad adoption of EVs, including, for example, the upfront costs, availability of charging, lack of education, unclear legal status, for example, being clear about EV charging companies not being a public utility. At this point in the growth of EV markets and their transition and the transition to their adoption, there's a lot of complexity. And this roadmap for electrification of transportation is a useful tool to help you manage that complexity. By providing you with examples of different approaches adopted around the country, the roadmap will help you define the outcomes that you are pursuing in your state, help you articulate the steps that you wish to accomplish. Camille.
Thanks, Dave. We recognize that there is some complexity in this topic. That's why we've tried to make it easier to understand. We created a roadmap for policymakers interested in transportation electrification. It contains a two-page fact sheet on the benefits of transportation electrification and a high-level policy plan. The roadmap also includes a policy guide that goes into more detail on the various issues. And it includes legislative options from a variety of states on planning, incentives, removing barriers, and empowering regulatory agencies. We want to emphasize that there are a variety of ways to approach transportation electrification and provide options and examples that enable you to choose the path that works for your circumstances. We will highlight some of these state examples in our presentation today. Please see the link provided to access these features. There are a variety of actions that states can take to accelerate transportation electrification. We've grouped these actions into the following four categories: planning provisions, incentives, actions to remove roadblocks, and actions to rev up regulators. These categories are interconnected, as planning and providing incentives will inherently remove roadblocks. We don't have time today to discuss examples in each area, so instead we'll provide you with several examples from each category. But there are many more examples in the roadmap. The first section we are addressing today is planning. States can and have taken great steps in planning for EVs. They've taken action to establish EV goals and timelines and state policy plans. States are planning to electrify state fleets, electrify buses, and medium and other heavy-duty vehicles. They're planning to designate and enforce EV parking. They're securing future sources of transportation funding. Today, I'm going to focus on examples from EV policy plans. With low penetrations of EVs, now is an ideal time for decision makers to ensure mechanisms exist in their state to coordinate among state energy offices, agencies of transportation, air quality, environment, commerce, tourism, energy, and public utility commissions. States have approached policy plans in a variety of ways. Some have focused on comprehensive plans, which encapsulate all of the sections we discussed on the prior slide, ranging from state goals to parking to regular assessments. There are 10 states with ZEV goals as part of their EV planning processes, and these tend to be comprehensive in nature. But some states aren't ready for a comprehensive process or are taking a piecemeal approach to a more comprehensive plan. Examples include Washington State, which has enacted regional transportation planning for their state for EVs. California, in addition to other planning areas, is looking at a sustainable freight plan. And New Jersey has a comprehensive plan, but different elements of it could be pulled out in smaller chunks. We're going to take a look more closely at the New Jersey example. New Jersey has adopted a phased approach to its EV charging infrastructure plan, and the part we'll focus on today is on building an essential network. This network is not meant to provide charging in every place you will eventually need to be in New Jersey. It's only meant to provide an essential services network that can reach most drivers. It recognizes that a strategically placed skeleton network could have value to address critically unmet needs now, stimulate EV adoption, and seed the market. Florida has adopted a similar essential charging network approach and added in requirements for sufficient charging to ensure efficient evacuation in the event of a hurricane or other emergency event. This is one illustration of smaller subsets of EV policy plans that states can take to jumpstart the EV market and provide needed infrastructure now. Ensuring access for all to the benefits of electric transportation is critically important. It comes up for states addressing EVs in every context. Consequently, there are examples from every category that we cover today. Let's take a quick look at a few ways that states are acting on equity concerns. In the context of planning, it is critical that states make sure everyone is included, and they can do this by engaging in a robust and inclusive stakeholder process. States will need the help of various communities to identify the barriers that they face and set the solutions and goals to meet their needs. Once a plan is in place, it's essential to track reasonable progress towards goals. Incentives are important. Some states have developed financial incentives for EVs for low-income populations. Mark will speak about these shortly. It's important to realize that there are some unknowns that need to be studied in order to effectively remove barriers. And California has required studies of low-income barriers to address this. Regulatory agencies can and should ensure that their processes are open and inclusive. It's important that state infrastructure plans, whether built by market participants or utilities, include guidelines to ensure that infrastructure is being made available across all socioeconomic and geographic parts of the state. Mark LeBel is going to discuss incentives for EVs next. Mark?
Thank you very much, Camille. I'll be discussing incentives for electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations. This spans a wide range of policies, and I'll only be touching on a few. There are some important high-level principles for incentives. We're trying to increase the relative attractiveness of EVs, lowering the cost and increasing the benefits. You want to make the programs durable so everyone knows what to expect, and you want to make the program simple, transparent, easy to administer and understand for car dealers and EV buyers. And as always, we want these programs to be efficient and cost-effective in the broadest sense. My first example is a rebate program for EV purchases and leases in Maine. It's run by Efficiency Maine Trust, which also runs the state's energy efficiency programs, which includes lots of other rebates. There's a base rebate for a full battery electric vehicle and a lower one for plug-in hybrids. Anyone who is qualified for low-income heating assistance in the previous 12 months is eligible for a bigger rebate. Only vehicles under $50,000 qualify for rebates for both equity and efficiency reasons. And customers can get the rebate immediately when they get their car, and the dealer will get reimbursed later. That's called cash on the hood. An example of a set of state-level charging station incentives is New York. The Charge Ready New York program is run by NYSERDA and provides rebates of up to $4,000 per port for level 2 charging stations. Eligible stations are at public parking facilities, workplaces, and multifamily buildings. Separately, There's a state tax credit for businesses or individuals. It's capped and it's also non-refundable, which means it only helps if you have a tax liability. They do subtract out other grants from the eligible costs. Lastly, there's a grant program for municipalities to put in public charging run by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. This doesn't even include the fact that the New York Power Authority is doing an EV fast charger build out, and there are some utility programs that are getting started. Lastly, incentives don't have to be explicitly monetary. One popular non-monetary incentive is allowing electric vehicle drivers to access high occupancy vehicle lanes, carpool lanes, to get where you want to go more quickly. That can work a little differently in different places. In Arizona, you can get an alternative fuel vehicle license plate. In Georgia, a similar special license plate also gets you toll-free access to an express lane on a major highway. In Maryland, it's not a license plate, but a special permit sticker for HOV lane access. And now I'll hand it back to my colleague, Dave Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mark. So as I mentioned earlier, to ensure the deployment of EVs and EV infrastructure, states will need to address barriers or roadblocks that we see out there. As you use the roadmap to help you define the outcomes that you're pursuing, be useful in showing you how other states are addressing many of these barriers. Let's consider two here. The first one, removing roadblocks associated with building codes. Home charging, where practical, is convenient for EV drivers. It's the most common practice around the country. But if you don't have a single family home with a garage, charging is not so easy. About a third of the US housing stock is comprised of structures with 3 or more dwelling units. In other words, multi-unit dwellings. In urban areas, this percentage can be much higher. The roadmap contains examples of improved building codes and other solutions that could help overcome barriers that are associated with multi-unit dwellings. For example, building codes like those adopted in Colorado can encourage the installation of EV infrastructure in buildings and parking spaces. Legislation can also give consumers a right to charge, so at least they can work out details with homeowner associations and property managers. Florida and Oregon have adopted right to charge laws. Another category of barrier or roadblock to EV development can be characterized as interoperability, or more precisely, the lack of interoperability. Well, what do we mean by that? Some companies require customers using their charging network to have a membership in that network in order to pay for charging their vehicle. An EV driver then needs to pay not only the cost of the charge, but also the network membership fee in order to charge the car. But that membership fee may not apply to another network that requires its own fee and membership. And what results then is a market comprised of individual, non-cooperating systems that make it difficult for drivers to move from one charging station in one network to a station in another network. State guidance on interoperability issues is crucial to ensuring that a fair and open charging system develops, especially a system where public money is being used to build out EV charging. The roadmap sets out various provisions and levels of guidance that could be useful in addressing this specific barrier. For example, legislation could direct a state agency to either adopt relevant national or international billing and disclosure standards, or in their absence, to develop standards for that state. Legislation could require transparency and disclosure of any network roaming fees at the point of sale, and require public disclosure on a database of the charging station's geographic location, a schedule of fees, accepted methods of payment, and any other charges for non-members. I encourage you to look at the roadmap, which contains other examples like these to help you understand how states have addressed many of these barriers to consumer participation and EV infrastructure rollout. With that, I'm going to hand the microphone to Rick Weston.
Thanks, Dave. And hello, folks. Really glad you could make it today. You know, the benefits of electric vehicles for consumers, for the integration of renewables into the power system, and for the environment won't materialize or materialize quickly enough without deliberate policy action. Much of the nitty-gritty implementation work will fall to utility regulators. Be sure that they have clear guidance on what you want them to do, and be sure that they have the requisite authority to do it. The roadmap identifies 6 areas for PUC action. There may be more. They are settling the status of EV station owners and operators. Are they utilities subject to PUC oversight? Most states have concluded that they are not, that in fact they're providing a different service. Making sure that utilities are planning for the impacts of EVs, their costs and benefits on their systems. Implementing smart rate designs for EVs to get the greatest economic benefit from their use and charging. Determining utility involvement in EV charging and setting the rules for recovery of the costs of utility charging equipment. These two are obviously connected. And as well, possibly implementing new regulatory mechanisms to reward the uptake of EVs and charging as a consequence of utility action. The roadmap goes into detail on these. I want to talk about 2 of them briefly by way of example. How and how much consumers pay for charging their EVs matter. It will affect the market for EVs and their impacts on the electric system. So developing smart rate designs for charging is an important element of the roadmap. The theme here is, as with all rate design, that we want customers to make consumption decisions that maximize both value to them and value to the system, and thus to the society and ratepayers in general. As you can see from this graphic, which describes a single day in New England, but is representative of most electric systems, the cost, at least in the north, the cost of producing electricity increases in real time as demand increases and decreases as demand decreases. Thus, the costs are changing across time, and smart rate designs attempt to reflect this reality. There are real benefits to rate structures that capture, to a meaningful degree, this time-varying nature of production costs. They encourage consumers to take advantage of lower cost times of day to use electricity. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about charging their cars, but we could be talking about any and all loads if we thought that's where we wanted to go. And there are obvious benefits of doing so. Reduced costs for customers and better utilization of the electric system. Unnecessary utility operating and investment costs can be avoided by flexible EV charging. And note as well that the opportunity to create more economically efficient rate structures for flexible loads like EV charging also gives a state an opportunity to reevaluate its overall approach to rate design and to consider whether the shortcomings of some of its legacy rate structures shouldn't also be addressed. Here are a couple examples of what states are doing. The top graphic is doesn't actually give the prices, it just shows relative prices of an optional seasonally differentiated EV only time of use rate for Baltimore Gas and Electric residential customers. As I said, it's optional. A customer can choose to charge her car at the rate she pays for all other service, or she can sign up for this tariff for her electric vehicle, obviously to do so, doing so in order to take advantage of the lower off-peak prices. Most EV charging, or much EV charging, can easily be shifted to the off-peak periods. So there are real savings here to be easily acquired. Green Mountain Power in my home state of Vermont offers several options beyond just the standard residential rate 1 flat kWh rate that you see there. They've got a whole house, all service, seasonal time of use rate. And they also have an EV only time of use rate. And lastly, a flat all periods time of use rate, excuse me, it's flat at all periods except for peak curtailment times with a very punitive high peak, on peak charge that the utility controls. In other words, you can override the control of the utility in this rate 72 if you want to take service during a peak time. But if not, then the utility will shut you off and you will just pay the other rate at all other times otherwise. So you have choices with Green Mountain Power as to how you want to charge your car. Okay, as you can see, the rates in some way reflect the general daily variations in the underlying costs of providing power. For the most part, the timing of EV charging really is discretionary. One can be flexible so long as one has a fully or at least sufficiently charged vehicle when one needs it. Consequently, EV charging loads are really well suited to time varying rates. You can save a lot of money by taking advantage of them. And finally, I want to just touch on utility involvement in supplying EV charging equipment and charging services. This is an important consideration for states. It is the degree to which you want utilities to be involved in the deployment of infrastructure and charging services. This applies to both public and private charging equipment. We acknowledge this is controversial. The extent of utility involvement is a subject of much debate, and the arguments on both sides have merit. There's a continuum, as this graphic shows, and where you end up is simply a decision that you have to make. Do you want only limited utility involvement? For example, utility make-ready up to certain points in the system. Massachusetts is going in this direction through PUC action. Do you want some degree of utility control over charging? The utility doesn't own the charging equipment, but it manages the charging. This would be, for example, the Green Mountain Power rate 72. In this way, you can have confidence that some measure of the benefits of time-varying charging will be captured for ratepayers. Or do you want soup to nuts provision of charging services by the utility? The roadmap goes into more detail on these choices. And again, there's much debate about which way to go. You just have to make a decision. I'll note that so far, no state has said that only the utility will provide charging services. A number of states have enacted legislation requiring utilities, though, to submit EV charging infrastructure deployment plans to their PUCs for review and approval. Colorado, New Jersey, California, and Oregon, for example, have required their utilities to do this. What's interesting here is that, for the most part, the scope of the utilities planning and possible investment is not circumscribed, which is to say that the degree of utility involvement and control over charging is at this point still to be determined and is being examined in utility commission proceedings. And there are other questions that you'll probably want to address. Who can provide the services most efficiently? The utility or third-party providers? Should the utility be the supplier of last resort, especially in hard-to-serve areas, places where there's not yet a market for EVs and charging? Should ratepayer-funded investment be used to jumpstart deployment and uptake of EV transportation? This is the kind of inquiry and decision-making that PUCs are well-suited to undertake. The key here is to charge them to do it and give them strong guidance to ensure that desired outcomes are achieved. Thanks much. Back to you, Camille.
Thanks, Rick. What we want to emphasize here today in our overarching message is that there's a variety of ways to act on transportation electrification, and that there are real benefits to doing so. Early action means states will also be able to reap the most benefits of the electrification transition to all state citizens, whether EV owners or not. Clara, back to you.
All right, well, this has all been fascinating, and we have a lot of questions. And please feel free to continue putting your questions into the chat. But to start off with, I'm gonna ask you all, but starting with Camille, if we recognize that the legislative landscapes are highly contextual, what would you say is the most important policy to focus on if a legislator could only introduce one bill next session, and where would they go to get more information about this?
Thanks, Clara. As you said, it's contextual. So there's going to be circumstances in states that will dictate what is the best path to take. And we go through some of those examples in the roadmap, which is where I'd suggest you go to look at what other states have done, because it's great to get ideas from what's already out there and how states have approached it. One of the biggest barriers that consumers state is concern about lack of EV charging infrastructure. So there's some plans that you can approach it in a variety of ways to have public-private investments in EV infrastructure and essential charging infrastructure, or other ways, or ratepayer-funded infrastructure from utilities. There's a variety of ways to provide infrastructure, and that is one barrier that needs to be overcome fairly quickly.
Great. Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. And I'll just reiterate what Camille said, that there is this roadmap available. So if anyone listening has further questions or wants to explore what options are available for transportation electrification, there are a wealth of resources at hand. The next question is directed towards Dave, and we know that states are really strapped for cash at the moment due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to ask about finances, and are any of these policies revenue generating, or are there ways to incentivize EVs in a way that's less costly?
Yeah, that's a tough question. But I think there are lots of ways for states to promote EVs that won't strain state budgets. Perhaps the first and most important thing to think about is for legislators to think about themselves as natural conveners. Legislators can get together and put together meetings with stakeholders, with other members of government. And this is a great opportunity not only to educate yourself, but to identify stakeholders. They're going to be very interested in telling you about benefits associated with EVs from their standpoint. They'll want to make their case, but it's a great opportunity to show the public and would-be investors in electric vehicles that your state is interested in this and interested in learning more about this. There are lots of topics to explore, as Mark and Rick and Camille mentioned: air quality, power system benefits, cost savings to consumers. Legislative committees can convene the right stakeholders to find out about how utilities in your state are thinking about this. They're going to be obviously a really key part of this. Are they planning for growth in electricity use? Are they coordinating with air regulators? Because there will be air quality implications here. Are they thinking about the time of use rates that Rick mentioned and that are so critical to taking advantage of that EV's flexibility in many cases, and getting at low cost and often cleaner sources of electricity? So this is a great opportunity as far as becoming, taking advantage of that convening authority. I think maybe another first step to consider is clarifying the legal status of EV charging station providers so the market can develop. And that's another no-cost way. Mark pointed out HOV lanes and other ways to encourage and provide incentives to drivers, providing special parking rights to EVs, other examples. I won't go on, but I probably could. I'm curious about what others may think about this topic. Point is, I think there are lots of things that can be done without spending a whole lot of money to educate yourselves and to let the public and would-be investors know that you're interested in going down this road.
This is Rick. This is Rick Weston. I just would add one point of another approach, another way to get at the low or zero cost equipment and EV adoption is to do, in fact, what Green Mountain Power did, which was to make the chargers available for low cost or no cost in exchange for the power to control charging. So the savings that were being acquired through smart management of load were able to be shared with consumers through the low-cost charger, as opposed to spending $600 on the home charger, a much smaller amount, or in certain cases zero. So there are ways of doing that, of capturing the savings at the electric system level and transferring them to the consumers.
That's really helpful. Actually, on the topic of the TOU rates, there are a couple questions about making sure that, is there a way for a TOU rate to be established that also recognizes when the power on the grid is greenest, and how are they working to incentivize off-peak charging?
Well, maybe Mark wants to jump in first. This is Rick again. Certainly the structure of the rates themselves should incentivize off-peak charging. So the differential between on-peak and off-peak matters. And there's been a bunch of work on this around the country about just how much that differential needs to be for people to respond to it. As for linking the rate structures to the greener sources of power, I think there are several ways to do that. Once again, I'm sorry to refer to Green Mountain Power. I just happen to be aware of this one. They do have opportunities. You are able to purchase renewable power, under your tariff as well. So you can do that. But also, I think, and Mark will probably tell us about this, there should be opportunities to manage charging in such a way that you take advantage of the variable nature of a PV, solar and wind power. And one could imagine a controlled charging program that would enable that. Mark, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of times the on-peak and off-peak rates align nicely with emissions. That's often been the case historically. As you design your time of use rates, that certainly is a good question to be looking at, to make sure that all the price signals are aligned in a good way. There can arise some tricky situations, perhaps in the Midwest right now, if coal is the marginal generator off peak and gas or renewables is a marginal generator on peak, then if you're shifting load from on peak to off peak, you might be accidentally encouraging slightly more generation from coal plants. This is probably a short-term transition question, hopefully. But there's other ways to get around that. If you want to purchase RECs or other things associated with your EV charging, there's other ways to address that too.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions about the gas tax. So several years down the road, once we're seeing wide adoption of EVs, what could replace the gas tax as a funding source for states?
Thanks, Clara. This is Mark again. So this is addressed at a high level in the roadmap. There's a provision that mandates that states do a study on this question with stakeholders. We did a more detailed webinar on this last year, and we have a short report on it that's about almost 2 years old now. There's some interesting wrinkles to this question. The first one is to recognize that EV owners contribute to a lot of different public funds, including transportation funds, despite the fact that they don't pay as much gas tax. So over the last couple of decades, since the federal gas tax revenue hasn't kept pace with transportation funding needs, more and more funding from income taxes and general funds has been used for transportation. So and similar things happen in individual states where where other pots of money are used for transportation funding. However, to the extent that we're really trying to stick to sort of a user pays principle, where car drivers are paying for the roads that they use, which is totally reasonable and has some great economic side benefits. It is important to think of what you're doing to your transportation tax base as you convert from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. A lot of states have started putting in these flat annual EV registration fees, which really haven't been designed in a smart way very far. A flat annual fee sends all the wrong signals, discourages EV adoption, and it's not well correlated with how much you use the roads. So there's some places where they've been thinking about VMTs or other options. There are, which raises implementation and fairness questions. There are some easier options, like if you wanted to have a battery size fee. So that if somebody has a small, Nissan Leaf 80-mile car, doesn't get driven as much and doesn't have as much impact on the roads as a massive new electric bus, you can have a per kilowatt hour of battery capacity fee, so that it scales with the size of the vehicle and probably the purchase price of the vehicle as well, and often the income bracket of the buyer. So there we'd encourage states to start to looking into some smarter versions of that.
Okay. The other hot topic in the question box are utilities versus the market. So what roles should be left to the market versus run by utilities? And then similarly, what are the cost differentials to consumers of having charging stations run by different entities? So I'm going to send that question to, I think Camille, Mark, and Dave might all have things to say about that.
Thanks, Clara. I don't think it's a question of should. Again, this will come about in each state and depending on the circumstances in each state on what determinations they make. There's obviously areas where the EV market is more developed because there's more drivers, closer amount of people together, which makes it more economically viable. But there's also areas where it is not developed, not likely to be developed for the foreseeable future. So the states will need to consider those options and figure out what is the best way to provide a network to meet that. Some states have looked at regional transportation plans, recognizing that there's different areas in the state that have different densities and different needs, and they might address it regionally first before it's interconnected throughout the whole state. Others, such as New Jersey, have said, look, we're going to start with an essential public charging network first, and we'll add on to that more in the future, and we'll plan to do so, but we're going to meet these needs first. So there's some different aspects of ways that states have addressed that. Mark or Dave?
This is Dave. Excuse me. I think that Rick touched on a really important point, and Camille also mentioned it here, and that is the states are going to have to decide this issue. The utility involvement in this, in developing EV infrastructure. In a number of states, utilities have recognized that there's some really hard to reach places where the quote unquote market is not going to be inclined to put money, and that the utilities have a role there. But states have taken their specific circumstances into consideration when they've explored this point. One feature of this roadmap that I just wanted to highlight here is that it recognizes that states are taking different stances on this topic, and it provides you with different points of view and helps you figure out the puts and takes associated with going either way or with going some sort of hybrid approach where utilities are involved in some of this, but the states refrain from allowing them to engage fully in this work.
Thank you both. A follow-up question to that is, to what degree is FERC involved in regulating charging station infrastructure?
This is not in FERC's jurisdiction. This is an area of state jurisdiction, just as states regulate utilities within within the state bounds. So it's up to states to determine whether or not EV charging infrastructure is or is not a utility. As we mentioned earlier, to date, all states have said that it's not a utility, and that in fact it provides a service. So states have either adjusted their definition to what is defined as a utility in their state to clarify that EV charging is not a utility function, or they have also clarified that EV charging provides a service and not retail sale of electricity.
That's helpful clarification. We've also had a few questions about how to address the lack of current infrastructure capacity for charging and ways to increase, similarly, ways to increase adoption of EVs. And to the question about infrastructure capacity, I'm going to direct that to Mark or Dave.
Sure, there are a lot of great steps that many states have been taking on this front. There's one thing to know is that the Volkswagen settlement from the problems they had with their diesel engines several years ago has provided a pots of money for the states to use, and up to 15% of those funds, a part of those funds, can be used to develop charging stations. So most, if maybe not quite all, states have been using a good chunk of that money for that purpose. So it's important to recognize that we have been plugging along on this for the last 5 years with different types of funding here and there. It could be the case that states want to look for new sources of funding. Some states have used general funds or bonding funds or other mechanisms to get more money dedicated to these programs. Some states are considering carbon pricing, transportation carbon pricing, to provide new funds for a variety of clean transportation efforts, rather. So there's a in addition to Dave touched on earlier, all the other approaches that don't take state funds, but if you can free up some money, there are a lot of great things that states are already doing and programs to follow.
I agree with that, Clara. I have nothing to add.
Excellent. Well, moving on then, there are some questions for states that are not as likely to fully adopt ZEVs. What are some ways that they can incentivize electric vehicles, and particularly what are some of those upstream incentives? And Dave and Camille, maybe you have something to say about that?
Sure. I think it's important to look at all these different aspects that we've talked about today. We've talked about the kind of 4 buckets of planning, incentives, financial and non, removing barriers, and empowering your agencies to work on this collaboratively. Any of those actions, any and all of those actions, will help incentivize EVs in the state. Clarifying a number of these actions really helps create a stable market for EV infrastructure and EV market participants to thrive. So to the extent that states can take action to clarify stance of how EV charging is regarded, to plan for it through various methods, and to remove barriers, are all going to be critically important ways to advance EVs in a state. Dave?
Thanks, Camille. I will make sort of one narrower point here. When we talk about EV charging, there are many subsets of that topic. I mean, we might think about the residential charging in the single-family home, and that actually is a really good place to start this discussion. But it's really important to remember that there also are fleets that need to be charged. There are transit buses, there are school buses, and not to mention other types of homes for residential housing as well, other types of markets for residential housing as well. But when you think about EV charging, I think it's so important to recognize that when you have a battery, you can fill that battery up with energy at any time of the day. And very typically with a level 2 charger, that only will take roughly 3 or 4 hours. So between the time you get home at night, 5, 6, 7 o'clock, and the time you leave in the morning, 12 hours later, there's a large window within which to charge that EV. With that flexibility comes the opportunity to use electricity at times when other people aren't using it. When there's less demand for that electricity, there's a lower cost for that electricity. And so what you find, Rick alluded to this, you find on-peak, off-peak charging opportunities that can be incorporated into time of use rates, or there can be just direct load control programs. The state of Maine has a program like that that they're working on. But what you're doing is taking advantage of that flexibility and the ability to charge at times of day when that fuel, that electricity is really far less expensive. And I think that's one of the most important things to put into place when you're getting started. There are going to be lots of tough knots to untie when it comes to charging for multi-unit dwellings, for transit, etc. But that first piece is really important because there are opportunities for residential EV users to save a lot of money charging, and for utilities to take advantage of, as regulators allow, that increased revenue that comes from that charging that takes place in the middle of the night.
This is Rick. I would just want to echo and emphasize these points. I guess for me, the way I see it is simplification is really important. Making it as unburdensome as possible for folks to charge their cars, inexpensively, easily, seems to me to be part of it. And I personally think, and this is just my own personal observation, I personally think that managed charging, automated by a third party or a utility, really has some real benefits to the system, real value that I think you really want to capture, because everybody can be on TOU rates, time of use rates, but if we're all charging our car at the moment the rate goes from the on-peak to the off-peak period, we're going to create other problems. So some kind of management in there, which really allows the system to take advantage of the charging in the best way, is also part of it, that I think can go a long way to breaking down barriers to EVs and charging.
Lots of good discussion there. We have been getting lots of questions about how do you properly design TOU rates and this difference between on and off peak rates and driving behavior. So this is a really good, helpful discussion. Another question that I'll direct towards Rick, is it appropriate to have specific utility rate categories that are just for individual electric vehicle owners?
Oh, I thank you for asking that question. Whoever did, I'm very glad you asked it. But I do want to answer one other question, though, that you alluded to, Clara, and that is, or that you mentioned, how to design TOU rates. Well, I think that's subject for another webinar. There's a lot of thought that has to, of course, go into how costs get allocated between on and off peak periods. And Mark, I know, has a lot of good thinking on that. With respect to rate structures for specific end uses. You know, I think the honest economist would say it's not the end use itself, it's the nature of the end use. So I guess what you'll hear me say is if there are other loads that a consumer wants to subject to the to flexible use, demand in the same way that you would with your EV, then if those loads can act in the same way as EV charging acts, well then I suppose as a purely intellectual matter, those loads should also be eligible for such pricing. And certainly we want to give consumers as many options as possible for how to manage their overall loads. So that's a good thing. But in this case, I guess I would say that EV charging is unique enough of a load that I don't have much heartburn by assigning a particular rate to it, especially as we're just really in the early years of this and really learning how it works, and discovering what the challenges and what the benefits truly are. One could imagine, and I hope this is the case at some point, that we'll not only be managing the charging of the EVs, but managing the use of the batteries as, in fact, suppliers to the system under certain conditions. And that, that'll be a really interesting and, of course, I think really economically valuable exercise. But at this point, I don't have too much heartburn with the EV only rates. Mark, you might have a thought or two.
If we have extra time in the next 30 minutes, we can go longer on that.
Thanks. Yeah, we still have lots of questions, so I will remind everyone that we're staying on an extra half hour to answer those questions. But one thing I just want to flag is there are so many benefits beyond the benefits to individual electric vehicle owners, and we'll talk about that more. But then also transportation electrification extends beyond individuals and also to states, and there are several states that have already looked at transitioning their state fleets to electrification. So with that, I want to toss it to Camille for final takeaways, and a reminder that we will stay on for another half hour for questions, and just thank you all so much for being here. Camille, over to you.
Thanks, Clara. I think one point that we want to emphasize here is that EVs are not just a tool for transportation and to get around. They also are a flexibility tool. They're going to help us to integrate large amounts of renewable energy, which is going to be cleaner and which is also going to decrease air emissions. They're going to be savings for people, and they allow us to realize greater electricity system benefits. We want to reiterate the benefits of EVs are numerous, and ongoing action by states will help to realize these benefits. We welcome your feedback on this material and your questions, and thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you for additional questions here shortly.
Thank you all for joining in today, and major hats off to the RAP team for all that they did to condense this information and make it understandable for a wide audience, and just be the experts for us on the topic of transportation and electrification. So with that, we will stay on for more questions, and the first one is, Camille, can you go more into some of the co-benefits of transportation electrification?
Yes, absolutely. So as I alluded to earlier, when EVs are able to charge at times that are essentially convenient to the grid with the correct signals that Dave and Rick have been talking about earlier on time of use rates. When they are able to charge at those times, they're able to soak up solar PV during the day and wind during the night. They're able to utilize and integrate more renewable energy that might otherwise not be utilized and be wasted. They're able to store up and integrate more of that renewable energy, but by using more of that clean renewable energy, it also helps to decrease the emissions from the grid as well. Second, EVs, especially when you strategically target where they're placed, such as buses and heavy duty vehicles as well, if you electrify that load, you're also decreasing a lot of the emissions from currently combustion engine vehicles. And currently, road transport causes 52,000 premature deaths each year. So to the extent that we electrify our transportation, we are decreasing a lot of air quality problems, and states can perhaps choose to look at specific areas that have air quality issues to address that proactively and first with EVs in those areas. EVs are also more cost effective for owners. We find that over the life cycle of the electric vehicle, when you no longer have to do maintenance costs that are more frequently associated with ICE vehicles, that it's actually a lower cost to the vehicle owner over the lifetime of the vehicle. So these are some of the areas where we found that there's benefits beyond what would most frequently be thought of for EVs. Can others add to this? Dave?
I think you did a great job clarifying that. I'd like to drill down on two things. The benefits, the environmental benefits associated with the car, and then with the fuel it uses. When you take a gallon of gasoline and take, whatever vehicle you may have, let's say it's a Honda Civic, you get 25 or 35 miles down the road with a gallon of gas. That's 120 megajoules of energy. And if you translate those megajoules into kilowatt hours, that's a little over 33 kilowatt hours. Basic EVs can go well over 100 miles, not 35 miles, well over 100 miles on the same amount of energy. That's a great benefit and really important for the environment. As far as the fuel goes, it's really important to recognize a couple things. The U.S. power sector has been on a trend to get producing energy with much less carbon. 1990 to 2015, the same amount of carbon is coming out of the U.S. power sector, the lower 48. But that power sector in 2015 is producing 30% more energy. So what you're doing is getting much less carbon on average out of the power sector. That's really important news. The final point here, however, alludes back to something that Mark pointed to. I've just talked about average emissions that affect fuel, but he pointed out that the inquiry here actually is related to marginal emissions. What is that next megawatt hour that's going to be brought on to supply the electricity needed to fuel those vehicles? That's more an inquiry into that is more detailed. It's going to be very locational specific, time specific, but when you consider both the fuel and the car, that to me is the big story about the environmental benefits associated with electric vehicles.
Have any states dedicated a ZEV fee to charging infrastructure? Maybe that's a question for Mark.
I want to say Colorado has done that with part of the fee that they've imposed, but that may be one to take offline and get out to people later.
We will follow up. We were talking some about how this plays in with the overall electric sector, and there's a question about that EVs are, they need a distributed charging system. So has there been any analysis on the impact or the impact of a distributed system load with EV charging adoption, and then the required investment to handle an increased load like that. That might be a question for Dave.
Synapse Energy Economics has done a couple of studies to look at, if I understand your question correctly, they did a couple of studies that looked at the effect of EV charging on the distribution systems of California's 3 large IOUs. And they found that as of 2019, that very little in the way of added investment was necessary to accommodate managed charging. In fact, they found that the utilities were getting net revenues. In other words, they were well, making a profit's not quite the right way to say it. They were making net revenues associated with managed charging.
A greater utilization of the existing network. Exactly. That's terrific.
Great. Another question similar to this question of distributed load is timing of load, and it sounds like with the TOU rates, the focus is on daytime load, and there are questions about, one, how to make sure that that's actually happening, but then 2, for people who are not on 9-to-5 schedules and are charging outside of that time. Are there any things we need to consider there in designing rates? And that might be a question for Rick.
Well, I'm gonna pass it directly to Mark.
So, if people with really unusual schedules may be hard to plan for, but you can try to make the rate design a little more advanced to accommodate more people. There are some time of use rates where an extremely long and broad on-peak period, which gives you very little flexibility, so that anytime you're awake, there's going to be a high price. However, a better practice is to have a narrower on-peak window to be able to avoid the on-peak times more easily. And then you can have a 3-period time of use rate where there's an on-peak, a mid-peak, and an off-peak. You can have different terminology for that. But if there's a rate with an off-peak that's from 12 a.m. to 5 a.m., then a lot of cars are smart enough that as long as you have them plugged in, they can start charging when the lowest price begins. So unless you have a truly unusual schedule that you have to be charging in the early evening or right when the peak happens, you're going to find a way to use the flexibility of the EV to take advantage of some of the lower cost pricing. So we've done entire webinars on how to allocate costs and do smart pricing. So happy to keep going if people ask more questions about it, but that's some of the basics.
That's great. And I think that covers a couple of the questions that we had here. So that's really helpful. There's a question about rebates for EV purchasing and what your thoughts are on rebates from a policy perspective, but also an equity perspective. And does it matter how they're funded?
Yeah, hi. This is Mark again. Happy to take that one. Yeah, I mean, of course it matters how they're funded, but that's very context specific. The more the funds are coming from a bit more well-off people, that some of these concerns might be lower. But I think states have been taking a variety of measures to make sure that incentives are implemented more equitably. As I mentioned, Maine and several other states have a purchase price cutoff threshold for vehicle eligibility. So if you're buying a $70,000 Tesla or a $100,000 electric vehicle, you might not need the rebate, both because you have enough, you have enough money to begin with, but also because it's probably not influencing the decision nearly as much. $3,000 out of $100,000 is a much lower percentage, and if you do some price elasticities, you can sort of get some guesstimates about how many sales you're influencing. So that's one tool. Another tool is some states are opening up eligibility to use cars for low-income people. As a general matter, you want to incentivize new sales, but you can make an exception to that to get used cars in the hands of lower-income folks. So those are just a couple of the tools you can use.
I want to ask about more regarding equity and access. A question for Dave or Camille: how do we get building codes to require multifamily and single-family dwellings to incorporate level 2 EV charging into parking or other levels of EV charging?
Well, passing those codes is probably the first step. I think there's some interesting examples. SWEEP, the Southwest Energy Efficiency Partners, I believe that's what SWEEP stands for, has put together a really good model building code for multi-unit dwellings. Parts of the U.S., there's a lot of building that goes on, and so those codes will be very helpful with the next housing unit that gets the next housing development that gets put up. It's much tougher with existing buildings, and this goes back to the rebate point that Mark was making. People with limited incomes have limited flexibility. They're not able to take advantage of these interesting and useful opportunities that come along, like electric vehicles. And I think a good program design is going to recognize those limitations and make and design itself to accommodate those specific needs. The state of Maryland, their utility commission came out with a really good order in January 2019 that looks at multi-unit dwellings and just recognized them as representing, in a large part in their state, the needs of low-income consumers. And the commission articulated a willingness to have rebate money support the creating access in parking lots and other spots around multi-unit dwellings to make this charging infrastructure available. They also noted, by the way, that people's assumptions may be that there's not going to be so much of a need. People aren't going to be so interested in electric vehicles because they don't have the income to go and buy them. And in fact, lower income parts of cities oftentimes have greater need, the occupants of those parts of the city have greater need for charging infrastructure. If you look at the profiles of Lyft drivers and Uber drivers, they're going to be coming from these working class neighborhoods that may not have that access. And so anyway, the Maryland Commission recognized these sorts of things in supporting multi-unit dwellings.
I just wanted to add that this is a huge issue. There's somewhere about a third of the housing stock in the U.S. Doesn't have access to garages. It's multi-unit dwellings. So addressing this is a key concern and should be a key concern for states. There's a variety of different ways that states have taken to get at this issue because there's a variety of ways that states address building codes across the U.S. Some have directed that either at the state level or that local municipalities update building codes to a certain standard by a certain date. As Dave mentioned, that can have effect for buildings that happen in the future, not now. So it can apply for new buildings and then substantial renovations is one method to do that. Other states have also enacted the requirement for charging on permit authorities, permitting offices as well. And I've also seen an example from some states that have put the requirement on builders to ensure that that happens. There's a bunch of other states as well that have specifically said that multi-unit dwellings and condo associations need to make charging available or may not create a barrier to do so. So there's a variety of ways that states can and have addressed this, and it is a critical issue to address.
Absolutely, and it's good to know that there are many ways to go about addressing it. This is a question for everyone, and it's what are we going to know in 10 years about the environmental and social impacts of EVs that we wished we knew the answer to now? This is very much if you could put on, look into a crystal ball, what would you see in the next 10 years regarding EV adoption?
Now, this is Rick. I'll start with the optimist's outlook. I think we're going to discover that their benefits, their economic and environmental and social benefits, are even greater than we imagine today.
So
Thank you.
this is Mark. One trend we might see if the battery sizes get larger, then there's going to be less need for public charging on a day-to-day basis around town, but more need for longer trips as people are more and more able to do that.
This is Dave. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a commissioner from a utility commission on a West Coast state that's been involved with transportation for a long time. I asked her, given what you know today, what would you have done 6 years ago when you started all this? And she said, I would have included the auto manufacturers in discussions. So to answer your question, I would say in 10 years, we're going to know if we included everybody we should have in the discussions that we're having today. That's just a bleak way of me saying we should assemble a big tent when we're starting off in states to explore this to make sure we're going to capture all the benefits.
I'll just add that, as I think I said before, EVs aren't merely a transportation tool. They have so much more flexibility that they can give to the grid for all these other benefits that we've talked about. And those are the ones that we know now. I anticipate that we'll figure out more ways in the future that we can be flexible to utilize them as a tool, as a battery, and in many more ways.
It's good to get that forecast, and especially to think back to how can we best leverage the benefits of electric vehicles through planning and also stakeholder engagement over time. We have a question about whether there should be a cap on a utility's contribution to the cost of EV infrastructure, and if so, what an appropriate cap would be, and what the methodology would be, basing it on the utility's share of revenues to come from the EVs being charged or something else. And I will direct that towards Mark.
Happy to take a first shot at it, and I'm sure other people have thoughts. That's one of those issues where different parts of a public utility commission may have different be of two minds, right? So in an EV proceeding, there's a focus on all the good that you can do for all the public benefits and ratepayer benefits of electric vehicles, but then at the end of the day, you have to deal with the cost recovery. If you apply good screening principles for the projects you undertake, there's often sort of a natural limit there. Imposing an artificial one may not make the most sense. As a general matter, I personally think that utility involvement is necessary, might be helpful to jumpstart the market, but you may be able to cut that back over time to more limited role. So there may be a way to sort of have a natural phase out that limits the overall rate impacts. You know, if we're talking about arbitrary thresholds, then that by definition, almost by definition, is going to be you know, it's going to take some shortcuts.
Thank
I
you.
agree with that. I have nothing to add to that. I agree with that.
Good to hear that there is agreement. Can we talk more about car sharing and mass transit as a form of transportation electrification?
Sure, yeah. Ride sharing and car sharing are great targets for electrification. Those cars often drive more miles than an average car, so you end up getting more utilization out of the battery, and that makes it more cost-effective per mile. So that's one theory where you could expect to see higher benefits and usage out of those cars and better economics from EV adoption. So that's a really promising thing that could start to happen in the next few years. And some nonprofit groups have been pushing Uber and Lyft to make commitments in that area. There are some questions about how you coordinate charging that can hopefully get worked through. Does anyone else want to take on the public transit question? I have some thoughts on that too.
I was just going to jump in on the ride sharing first, Mark. I agree with you. It's a really good model, especially when you think about the needs of rural states. Ride sharing occurs now. How do seniors who don't have their licenses anymore, how do they get to the doctor? How do they get to the store to buy groceries? It's ride sharing. So if EVs can be put into place where those sort of activities are occurring, they're happening at the community level, for example, that could be very beneficial, cost beneficial, and also just beneficial to providing those services. There's a really good example in the Central Valley in California. It's called the Raiteros program that has been supported by Green Lining Institute and others there, that basically just builds on the scale of transportation that has been adopted already and tries to put electric vehicles in place of the internal combustion engine vehicles that have been used so far.
Okay. We also have a question about, given the benefits of transportation electrification and changing economics, changing forms of transport, what are the strongest job and economic development arguments for creating more electric transportation infrastructure?
Well, I'll toss out one example. When you think about the multi-unit dwellings that need to be, let's say, retrofit for EV charging, those are construction jobs. The tar needs to be taken up, conduit needs to be laid, and construction workers and electricians and others that are involved in the building trades now could take advantage of the work that needs to be done in that context.
I'll just pass on that Minnesota looked at this question on jobs, and they found that by installing 150 EV chargers, that it would generate 14.2 million in economic activity in the state, and 4.6 million of that would be in labor income. There's also been various projections about how electrification in general can add to the GDP annually, and how much this can benefit society as a whole as well.
Speaking of those broad societal benefits, I'm mindful that we have had a lot of great questions and a lot of great discussion, but we're nearing the end of our time together. So I want to turn it over to Camille and any other panelists who want to give us some final thoughts.
Thanks, Clara. It's really been a pleasure to have all these questions and this great discussion today about this topic. We hope you've learned some more about the benefits of EVs and how states can realize those benefits by a lot of different actions that can be taken now and that other states have already done to do so. We welcome your feedback on this material and your questions now or afterwards, and thank you for joining us today.
Many thanks, everyone, for an excellent webinar, very informative. And as a reminder, if you're curious to learn more, there is a roadmap on electric vehicles that is available in the chat. You can click on that link, and it's also available on the RAP website. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, please follow up with any outstanding questions.